What's up guys, Ethan here. Today I wanted to do a video talking about VirtualBox, and I wanted to run through all of the basics with VirtualBox because I find that when people are starting to show interest in virtual machines, the first step usually is not to move on to something advanced like QEMU, and they just want to figure out how a virtual machine is made and how they work, but there isn't really a clear, way to start because people don't know where to begin. So I wanted to go through VirtualBox because I find that it's a free platform for making virtual machines. Most of it is open source. I believe there are some parts of it that are proprietary, but for the most part, it'll do everything that you need it to do. It runs on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and the majority of operating systems that most people use for desktop. They even have support for like Solaris, and they might actually have support for BSD. Regardless though, to start with VirtualBox, it depends on which distribution you're running. What operating system. So in my case, I'm on Linux, and I'm going to go over Linux in a second, but you'll see these are the platform packages. So if you're on Windows, you're going to want to click on Windows hosts, and it's going to give you an exe installer, and you can run that and install VirtualBox. For OS X, same process. You're going to get a DMG. You're going to want to follow the instructions prompted when you open both the exe and the DMG file and install that. And for Linux, it gets a little bit more complicated, or maybe you think it's easier, just not the same. Now, the other thing that you want is the extension pack, and this is going to give you additional features. Now, if you're on Windows or Mac, you're going to want to download this. But if you're on Linux, a lot of the time there's going to be a package for your distribution that contains the extension pack. So under the Linux distributions, they're going to show you all of the supported things right here, like all the packages. And you could try to install them this way, but typically the way that it works is you're just going to want to, like, if you're on Ubuntu, is like in the repository, so you do like sudo apt install. Or if you're on Arch, it'd be sudo pacman-s. And if you're on Gentoo, of course, you'd emerge it. And I'm going to go quickly show what my flags are for VirtualBox. So there aren't really many to worry about. In fact, they're pretty straightforward. Also for audio, Java is just a default flag for this program. OpenGL, of course, because you want it to have some sort of acceleration. Pulse Audio, again for audio. Qt5, which is just how you're going to get a graphical interface, and that's all I have running here. Now additionally, you also have VirtualBox Additions package, which is the ISO file that contains VirtualBox guest editions, and you're probably going to want this. Again, this should come with VirtualBox. It'll be installed somewhere on Windows and Mac, and on Linux it may be a separate package for you depending on your distribution. And like I was saying here, there's an extension pack also as a package. Now additionally, VirtualBox also needs kernel modules on the host. So in my case on Gentoo, there's the VirtualBox modules package right here. But for you, like on Arch Linux, I know there's another package. You're going to want to follow your Linux distributions wiki. On Windows 10 and Mac, they should install themselves through the exe or DMG installers. So nothing you need to worry about there. So that's the extent that I'm going to cover installing VirtualBox. And now we can get on to actually using VirtualBox. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is actually open VirtualBox, and this can be done by either like double clicking on an icon if it was made, or searching for VirtualBox. It's just going to be a program called VirtualBox, so however you open programs on your system, that's how you're going to find it. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is go into Preferences, and we're going to go to Extensions, and there's a little green Add button right here, and you're going to want to add your extension pack. Now on Linux, at least for my distribution, which is Gentoo, there's going to be an automatically installed one because we installed the package containing it. Of course, if you're going to be on Windows or Mac, I already showed you where the download link for this was, so you're going to want to click Add, and then navigate to where you downloaded the extension pack and open it. This is going to give you a couple extra features built into VirtualBox. It's not entirely necessary, but if you want the best virtual machine experience, that's what you're going to want to install. The next thing that you're going to want to look at is in General, and it's the default machine folder. Now, what this is this is going to contain where your actual image for the machine is stored, And by default on Linux, it's stored in your home directory and then the hidden folder .virtualbox and then machines. This is going to contain basically everything to do with your virtual machine. Default should be fine, but if for some reason you want it somewhere else, this is where it's changed. Besides that, we shouldn't have to touch anything else. So we're going to exit this and we're going to start adding a machine. So to do that, you can do new to create your virtual machine. And I'm going to run through and install for a Linux distribution. And I'm also going to do one for a Microsoft Windows 10 install, just so you can see the two main ones. Of course, there's options for many other OSs and even an other tab. The reason I'm not going to go over Mac OS is because Macs are not installed in a conventional way. And if you want to get Mac OS running in VirtualBox, there's a lot more videos out there, and I might make one in the future, but it's a little bit of a different process. So to start, let's do Linux, and we're going to choose what type of Linux. Now in my case, I'm going to install Ubuntu 64-bit, and something to note here is that you may not get the option to use 64-bit, and if that's the case, you're going to have to navigate into your BIOS and enable either VT-D or some other, it might be called VT-X. It's dependent on whether or not you have an Intel or an AMD CPU, and the option can differ, so you're just going to want to enable virtualization in the BIOS. Now, next thing that we're going to want to do is name the operating system. You can name this whatever you want, but the name also may change what OS you're running. So if I type in Arch, for example, it'll automatically set this to Arch Linux, and of course I can reset this back to whatever I want, but that's just something to be aware of. So in my case, I'm just going to type Ubuntu and go next. Oh, you know what? I actually already have one in there. So I'm going to call this Ubuntu test. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is select the amount of memory that we want to allocate to this virtual machine. Now, if you've never used virtual machines before, when you allocate memory to them, it takes the chunk away from your host system as if it was always active for the virtual machine. Now, this only takes effect when the virtual machine is running, but I would only allocate as much as you're willing to always have lost while it's running. So 25 to 50% of your memory is okay. This red line over here indicates that you may be going past what's safe, and your host machine may lock up or freeze because of lack of memory. Now, memory in general is calculated as a multiple of 1024 megabytes. So if you want 4 gigabytes, 4096 megabytes is what you'd want. And in my case, I'm going to give this 16 gigabytes since I have 64 in the system. So that's 16384 megabytes. And we're going to go next. Now, for this part, we're going to create a virtual hard disk. And it's going to give us options of what kind we want to use. In our case, VDI will suit our needs, and it's basic, so we're going to select that and say next. Now there's an option between dynamically and fixed size. The difference is actually listed right here. Dynamic means that when you use up the space on the VDI file, which is the virtual hard drive that the VM will have, that's how much space is actually used on the host. So if you allocate 40 gigabytes is just the cap of how much can be used, and it'll only use as much as actually is on it. Fixed size, however, will take the entire chunk that you allocate. So if I give it 40 gigabytes, all 40 will be taken, but it's a little bit faster since it doesn't have to keep reallocating as it's getting bigger or smaller. In my case, I'm going to click dynamically allocated since I don't see any need for this to be extremely fast. It'll be plenty fast as is. Now we're going to allocate some space. So in my case, I'm going to say 32 gigabytes is plenty for what we're using this for. Now that we have the virtual machine actually added in VirtualBox, we want to change a few settings to give us the best possible experience. So let's click on the settings right here, and let's just click through these a little bit. Under System, what I noticed initially is that we can choose EFI, and EFI is actually really nice, but I wouldn't check that off unless you have a specific reason to want to use EFI. It'll just use legacy BIOS instead. Under Processor, this is really important. This allows us to use several threads on our host's CPU, even if the host CPU has, say, 24. We can say, hey, you can use 4 of those. Now, unlike memory, it doesn't take all of the cores away from the host. It just sets a limit to how many threads can be used by the virtual machine. Now, I would keep this in a multiple of 2. So I would say 2, 4, 6, etc. And I wouldn't use more than half of your CPU cores. So for me with 24 CPUs, I would use 12 max. In my case, 4 is actually going to be more than enough. And finally, acceleration. This is going to let us actually choose what hypervisor we want to use. Now I'm going to say default. This is going to depend on what OS you have as a host, but you may have KVM like we do on Linux. You may be able to use Hyper-V. Legacy and minimal I wouldn't recommend, and I'm not sure if none is going to work very well, but we're going to go ahead and stay with the default. Let's move on to display now. Video memory is how much memory the virtual graphics card will have. I recommend just cranking this up to max unless you have very, very poor hardware. I'm pretty sure this is only using the CPU for the most part, so it shouldn't matter if your GPU is up for the task since you're not using your GPU for these virtual machines. One really important thing, however, is to enable 3D acceleration, and you're going to only be able to use one of these graphics controllers. You'll see it's going to tell you want to use VMSVGA, which is this right here. And 3D acceleration is like what a compositor handles. It allows you to see those smooth transitions that a graphics card would typically be responsible for. So I definitely recommend enabling this, and it should work pretty well under a Linux guest and even sometimes under a Windows guest. We're almost done here. So let's move on through audio. You can leave all of this alone. I'm actually going to put this onto Pulse Audio though. Network, you can set this to NAT, but if you have anything more advanced like I do, for example, I have a bridged adapter called BR0. You can use that. VirtualBox will typically make its own, for example, VIR BR0, but that's not what I'm going to use in this case. You may want to. USB 2.0 will suffice, but if you have any specific reason that you want to use 3.0, go for it. Shared folders, we might get into in another video, but for now we're going to leave this alone. And that's about all. So let's go ahead and say OK, and let's start the virtual machine. So at this point, we start the virtual machine, and it's going to ask us for an optical disc, and what this is asking for is an ISO of some sort. So it's as if you flashed some instance of Linux onto a USB and you were going to plug it in and boot. So what we're going to do is we're going to add, and we're going to find some ISO. So in my case, I've actually downloaded many over the course of this hard drive's lifespan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab Ubuntu. Let's find it. It is 20 point. We'll do it by name just so I can find it easier. It's 20.04.1 desktop AMD 64. That's what I'm looking for. And we're going to choose it and start. And I'm going to full screen this. Now at this point, it's going to start up the... I'm going to actually resize this real quick as well to make it easier. Here we go. That's better. So when we click, it's going to tell us that it's going to capture our mouse, and right control is going to uncapture it. So we're going to accept that, and we're going to just install it. So let's install Ubuntu. And this is going to go exactly how a regular installation will go. So I'm going to cancel the checks because we don't do checks here. It's typically, it verifies the integrity of the installation media as well as the hard drive, I believe, or it might actually just be the installation media, but in our case, that doesn't matter since we're not really installing this onto hardware. It could be bad and that wouldn't be a huge deal. So we're going to run through it. So I'm going to say English, doesn't matter to me, minimal, don't bother downloading updates since we're not going to be using this for very long. And we don't want anything third party either. We just want the just very bare minimum basic installation. And we can go ahead and erase disk, and it's going to show us right here that we have SDA and it's going to be ext4. And what you might not realize initially is that the hard drive that the virtual machine sees is not your hard drive, but it's just a file that we've created that it thinks is a hard drive. So you have no risk of potentially erasing what's on your main system within a virtual machine because it has no idea that it actually exists, your main hard drive. It doesn't know, it just knows what you let it know, which is that there's a file and it thinks it's a hard drive. So we're going to give this a name. We're going to call this virtual, and we're going to set this password as password. Yes, it's a weak password, you're right. Log in automatically, who cares? and it's going to go ahead and install. So I'm going to come back when it's done. So the installation is finished, so we're going to press restart now, and we're going to let it restart itself. It wants us to remove the medium, so the way we can actually do that is click devices up at the top, and where it says optical drive, we can remove disk. Now in our case, it actually will unmount itself automatically after the first run through, so we're just going to press enter and let it go ahead. So see, there's no disk inserted right now. So what we're going to run through now is we're going to install the guest additions, which are additional kernel modules and drivers that are going to give us a better user experience under this virtual machine hypervisor. So we're going to say next to all of these prompts, and I'm not going to allow any data to be collected because this is a virtual machine, so it's not going to be very useful information to them. Maybe it is, but we're not really using that for this anyways. So to install your guest additions, there's going to be a button down here under devices that says insert guest additions CD image. We're going to press insert on that, and we're going to get a prompt. You might not get a prompt depending on what distribution you're using, but in general there's going to be some indication that you've inserted it. Either way, it's actually going to prompt us right now if we want to run this file, and we're going to say yes, give it the password, which we already set, and let it run through. Now you can see that it's just going to go ahead and install a bunch of stuff for us. So we're just going to let this run. It's finished, and we're going to press enter to complete it, and we're going to restart the VM. I mean, this is pretty basic. VirtualBox and Ubuntu itself makes it very easy to do all of this. So that's nice, and some distributions may not be so accommodating, but it's pretty self-explanatory to figure this out. And on your distributions wiki, there should actually be a page for a VirtualBox guest install that'll guide you through any additional steps you need to take. So at this point, under displays, we can actually set the resolution. Now in my case, we're just going to set this to something that's 16 by 9, if there's anything. So here, 16 by 9. And you can see that the resolution has increased, so we're going to move this down to say 150%. And we might actually also be able to resize from here. Okay, we can. That's really nice actually. And that's something that you can only do with the guest additions. So we're going to do full screen mode, which is host F. And you can see we have everything working. And 3D acceleration is also working for the most part. You can see that there's some smooth animations happening. And while it's not very fast, it gets the job done. So if you want to use your virtual machine now, you should have proper network connection. You should have proper audio. And besides that, everything is running. So that's a Linux guest. Now what we're going to do now is I'm going to cut the video, and then we're going to come back once we have a Windows VM installed. So every step up to this point is basically the same, doing a Windows installation. The only difference is going to be how we install the guest additions. So we're going to come back once we're already booted into Windows and we're ready to install the guest additions. So once you're booted into Windows, and in this case I'm using Windows 10, but it should support Windows 7, 8, 10, and maybe even some older ones. Maybe even 11, I'm not 100% sure. But once you're booted in, it's going to be the same process. You're going to go to devices, you're going to insert guest additions, and then you're going to get a prompt, and you can click on that prompt, or you can open up the actual files, and you're going to run the vbox windows additions.exe, and you're going to say yes to that prompt, next, install, and it's going to run through and give you all the drivers that you need. So see, it's going to show up with a system device. It's going to be a network thing, I believe. It may be, I'm not 100% sure. It might be the video driver as well. Oh, okay. So something that I want to point out actually is once that driver installed, the mouse cursor is synced with the one that I'm using on my host. So I'm going to go ahead and let this reboot. And I'm going to come back because Windows takes a while to reboot. All right, here we are, booted back in. We're going to go ahead and log in. And it's going to be basically the same process. So this may be a graphical glitch. I haven't used Windows in a long time, so I'm not sure if the transparency is meant to be there. One of the cases where virtual machine may not be perfect, but we can resize the window like we could before. And I'm also going to full screen this. This may glitch out a little. So here we are, we have a functioning Windows 10 virtual machine. under display settings. It's going to take a moment. Again, Windows, not even Windows, but virtual machines in general are not always great with 3D acceleration. And on a system like Windows 10, you can't actually choose to disable the 3D acceleration like you can on a Linux machine by disabling your compositor. So things are going to be buggy and glitchy, but with enough work and tweaking, you can get it to run pretty well. And I know this visual is not a great example of that, seeing as the whole Windows 10 Windows Explorer has crashed, but we're actually going to chalk that up to a Windows moment. So we're just going to ignore that happened. With that being said though, that is the basics of how to run a virtual machine. So I showed you how to do Linux, and I showed you how to install the guest editions for both a Linux guest and a Windows guest. And this guide should be exactly the same on any Linux distribution that you run, a Mac OS host, a Windows host, and a Linux host. All of the steps should apply. So if you're confused, join my Discord and you can ask me questions there, or you can ask questions in the comments. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more of my content, and with that being said, I will see you next time. Bye bye.